Tonight, let us step back, not into a battlefield, not into shouting armies, but into a quiet room where a child lies awake, listening to a prophecy that will follow him for the rest of his life. They say, on the night he was born, the great temple of Artemis burned to the ground, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Reduced to ash, the priests whispered, "This child will set the world on fire." His name was Alexander, and before he ever held a sword, before he crossed an ocean, the world had already decided he would not live quietly. Pause for a moment. Imagine this: a boy, barely old enough to understand fear, raised in the shadow of a powerful father, a man who ruled through strength, discipline, and command. Philip of Macedon. Philip did not raise a dreamer, he raised a weapon. From an early age, Alexander was taught to watch carefully, to listen, and to remember. Love was earned, never given freely. But there was another influence, far quieter and far more dangerous. A philosopher, Aristotle. He did not teach Alexander how to fight. He taught him how to think. Through stories of heroes, of Achilles, of honor and glory, Alexander's mind began to stretch beyond Macedonia. At night, by flickering oil lamps, the boy read quietly. He did not dream of ruling a kingdom. He dreamed of the edge of the world. But destiny is heavy, and it presses hardest on the young. Philip tested him constantly: strength, obedience, control. Alexander learned to stand tall even when doubt pressed inward. He absorbed everything. Then came the horse, wild, untamed, no man could ride it. Soldiers failed, handlers failed. Alexander did not laugh. He watched. The horse stood restless in the courtyard, muscles tense, eyes wide. Every man who approached it failed. Some were thrown aside. Others stepped back in frustration. Laughter rippled through the court, but Alexander remained still. He noticed something subtle: the way the animal flinched, not from men, but from the dark shape stretching beneath its own feet. The horse feared its shadow. Quietly, Alexander walked forward. He did not shout. He did not rush. He turned the horse gently toward the sun, where the shadow faded into nothing. Then, slowly, he placed his hand upon its neck. The animal calmed. Moments later, Alexander climbed onto its back and rode forward, steady and controlled. As the courtyard fell into stunned silence, Philip watched closely. This was not strength, not force. This was understanding. The boy had not conquered the horse. He had listened to it, and in that moment, Philip saw something shift. Not a reckless child, not merely an heir, but a mind capable of seeing what others missed. A quality no army could teach. From that day forward, Philip treated Alexander differently, more harshly, more deliberately. Expectation pressed heavier than before. The boy was no longer allowed mistakes. Every lesson became a test. Every success raised the bar higher. And Alexander learned quickly that greatness did not arrive gently. It demanded endurance and silence. At night, alone with his thoughts, Alexander returned to the stories Aristotle had shared. Achilles, heroes who chose glory over comfort, men who lived briefly but burned brightly. The idea took root. If he could not escape destiny, then he would outrun it, even if it led him to the very edge of the world. As Alexander grew, the tension between father and son deepened. Philip was a warrior king, hardened by scars and conquest. Alexander was sharp, observant, already questioning the limits of Macedonia. Praise was rare, criticism constant. Philip believed pressure forged greatness. Alexander believed greatness demanded vision. Neither yielded, and slowly respect turned into rivalry, spoken only in silence. At court, Alexander watched closely. He studied generals, envoys, rivals. He learned how power moved, how loyalty shifted, how words could wound as deeply as blades. Even as a youth, he understood this truth. Empires were not built by strength alone, but by perception, timing, and control. Philip sent him into danger early, not to protect him, but to test him. At just 16, Alexander was left in charge. While his father marched away to war, a rebellion rose quickly. Most would hesitate. Alexander did not. He struck fast, crushed resistance, and founded a city in his own name. A quiet declaration of intent. Yet success only widened the divide. Philip took new wives, new alliances, new ambitions. At a royal banquet, wine loosened tongues. Insults were exchanged. Accusations spilled into the open. Father and son stood opposed, not with weapons, but with pride. For the first time, Alexander realized his path might not run beside Philip's, but beyond him. That night, Alexander left the palace, not in defeat, but in reflection. He walked beneath the stars, weighing loyalty against destiny. Macedonia was too small for the fire growing inside him, and though he did not yet know how, he understood one thing clearly. The world would not be given to him. It would have to be taken. Philip's reign ended suddenly. A celebration meant to display unity turned into chaos. In the midst of music and ceremony, the king was struck down. A blade, a gasp, then silence. Macedonia stood stunned. Alexander was only 20. Too young, some whispered. Too untested. But the crown did not wait. It passed to him. In a moment that changed everything. Grief had little time to settle. Power attracts challenge. Rivals circled immediately. Cities questioned loyalty. Old enemies sensed weakness. Alexander responded without hesitation. Not with fury, but with precision. He moved swiftly, securing borders, silencing dissent, making it clear that youth did not mean uncertainty. Macedonia now had a king, and he intended to be obeyed. Some resisted. Alexander made examples, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Fear traveled faster than armies. Soon the message spread. The boy king was no boy at all. He commanded respect through decisiveness and loyalty, through unwavering resolve. Those who doubted him either bent or vanished quietly from history. With his throne secured, Alexander turned his gaze outward, eastward, toward lands spoken of only in stories and trade routes. Persia, an empire vast beyond imagination, older, richer, confident in its size. Most kings would hesitate. Alexander felt something else, a pull, as if his entire life had been preparing him for this single direction. Before leaving Macedonia, Alexander paused. He visited his father's tomb. No words were spoken, only a quiet understanding. The rivalry had ended. The shadow lifted. Now the weight of the world rested on his shoulders alone. He turned away, toward the rising sun, and began the journey that would carry him far beyond the limits of any king before him. At dawn, Alexander stood before the narrow waters of the Hellespont. Asia lay beyond, vast, ancient, and waiting. He stepped onto the shore first, spear in hand, and cast it forward, symbolically claiming the land, not as a visitor, but as a conqueror. To his men, it was ritual. To Alexander, it was destiny taking shape. Before marching inland, he turned toward Troy, not for strategy, but for meaning. He walked among ruins, touched stones worn smooth by time, and honored Achilles, the hero of his childhood dreams. Some kings sought victory. Alexander sought immortality, to live a life that would outlast his bones. The army moved slowly at first. Macedonians, Greeks, allies bound by promise and pay. They crossed rivers, passed villages, and felt the weight of marching into unknown lands. Ahead stood Persia, an empire older and richer than anything they had faced. Behind them, there would be no easy return. Word of Alexander's advance traveled faster than his army. Persian governors debated. Some underestimated him. Others prepared defenses. They saw a young king, bold, perhaps reckless. They did not yet understand that Alexander moved, not from caution, but from certainty, a dangerous thing, in the hands of ambition. As night fell, campfires flickered across the plains. Alexander walked among his soldiers, speaking quietly, listening more than commanding. He knew fear lived in every camp, but so did hope. Tomorrow, the dream would meet resistance, and the path toward legend would begin to demand its price. The land grew unfamiliar. Roads narrowed. Hills pressed inward. Scouts returned with quiet urgency. Persian forces were near, not yet an army, but enough to test resolve. Alexander listened carefully, measuring not numbers, but timing. This would be the first moment. The dream faced resistance, and first impressions, he knew, would echo far beyond the battlefield. That night, sleep came lightly to the camp. Some men sharpened blades. Others stared into fire. Alexander moved among them. Unarmed, unannounced, he spoke softly, asked questions, learned names. He wanted his soldiers to feel seen. Because fear fades faster when leadership feels close, and tomorrow, fear would be tested. At dawn, the Persians appeared, light cavalry, swift, confident. They expected hesitation. They expected disorder. Instead, they found a formation already set. Alexander did not rush. He waited, then moved, precise, controlled, as if the moment had been rehearsed 100 times. The clash was brief, but decisive. Macedonian discipline cut through Persian speed. When the enemy broke, they fled quickly, surprised not by defeat, but by its certainty. The message traveled fast. This young king was not reckless. He was calculated. And calculation, when paired with courage, is far more dangerous than rage. Victory brought confidence, but Alexander did not linger. He pressed forward, securing cities, offering mercy where possible, force where necessary. Each decision tightened his control. Each step forward made retreat harder. Behind him, bridges were burned, sometimes literally. Ahead, only momentum remained. Soon, news reached the Persian court. Darius, great king of kings, listened carefully. He ruled an empire, spanning continents. This Macedonian advance felt inconvenient, not threatening. Not yet, but whispers began about a young commander who moved too confidently for his age. Darius responded with restraint. He sent envoys, offers of land, gold, titles, a chance to turn back with honor intact. Many kings would have accepted. Alexander did not. To him, the offer was not peace. It was permission to stop becoming who he believed he was meant to be. As the army marched on, the scale of Persia revealed itself. Cities vast and ancient, walls that seemed endless, resources beyond counting. Some soldiers began to wonder if they had marched too far. Alexander sensed it. He spoke less now. His confidence became quiet as steady presence, rather than a rallying cry. Soon, the confrontation could not be avoided. The armies would meet in open ground, not a skirmish, not a test, a true battle. One that would decide whether Alexander was a rising force or a brief disruption in Persia's long history. The night before, the camp was silent. Alexander did not sleep. He stood alone, looking east, not at the enemy, but beyond them, toward everything he had not yet reached. Tomorrow, the world would learn his name in a new way, and the path toward legend would no longer be imagined. It would be written, step by irreversible step. Morning arrived slowly. Mist clung to the ground, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Across the plain, Persian banners stirred, thousands of men, endless lines, armor catching the light. For many in Alexander's army, this was the moment fear became real, not imagined, not distant, but standing directly ahead, waiting. Alexander rode along the line, not shouting, not demanding. He reminded them why they had come, not for gold alone, not for plunder, but for something rare, a chance to be part of a story larger than their own lives. He spoke calmly, and calm, in the face of overwhelming numbers, was contagious. The Persians advanced first. Their cavalry surged forward, fast and confident. Arrows darkened the air. Shields rose in unison. Macedonian lines held. Alexander waited. He always waited, until the exact moment when hesitation would cost less than action. Then he moved. With precision, he drove a wedge into the Persian formation. Not everywhere, just once, at the weakest point. The shock was immediate. What looked like an unbreakable mass began to bend. Then crack. Alexander pressed forward, not chasing chaos, but creating it. The battlefield dissolved into noise, steel shouting, dust rising thick and blinding. Yet within the chaos, Alexander remained focused. He did not fight wildly. He fought toward objectives. Commanders, standards, moments that shifted momentum. Victory, he knew, was decided by direction, not fury. When the Persian center faltered, panic followed. Orders tangled, signals failed, men began to retreat, not together, but individually. That difference mattered. Alexander pressed harder, turning retreat into collapse. What began as a measured engagement became a rout that echoed across the plain. By midday, the battle was decided. The Persians withdrew, leaving behind supplies, weapons, and stunned disbelief. Against expectation, against scale, against history itself, Alexander had won, not through luck, not through chance, but through control, applied at exactly the right moment. The aftermath was quiet. Bodies lay still. Dust settled. Alexander walked the field slowly. Victory weighed heavily. He knew this was not the end, only the beginning. Persia had felt a blow, but the empire still stood, and empires, when wounded, do not forgive. News of the battle traveled fast. Cities reconsidered resistance. Allies reconsidered loyalty. Alexander's name spread. Ahead of his army, no longer as a rumor, but as a force, the boy king had crossed a line from challenger to contender. That night, the camp rested uneasily. Some slept deeply, exhausted. Others stared into the dark, realizing the world had shifted beneath their feet. Alexander sat alone once more. He had taken his first step into Persia, and the road ahead, now clearly visible, led only forward. Far away in Persia, the news arrived quietly. No dramatics, no panic, just words delivered to a man seated on a golden throne. Darius III listened, without interruption. His face remained still, but inside something tightened. This was no border skirmish. This was an invasion. That refused to stop. Darius was not inexperienced. He ruled an empire. That stretched farther than most men could imagine. Generations of kings before him had crushed rebellions with ease. Yet this was different. The reports spoke of speed, of discipline, of a young commander who did not behave like conquerors usually did. Darius ordered preparations, not haste, not fear, precision. He would meet Alexander, not as a reacting king, but as a ruler reminding the world who held true power. Armies gathered slowly, carefully. Persia had time, or so it believed. Meanwhile, Alexander moved forward. City after city opened its gates. Some welcomed him. Others surrendered quietly, hoping obedience would spare them. Alexander accepted both. Resistance was crushed quickly. Submission was rewarded. The message was clear: the faster you choose, the less you lose. Alexander began to adapt. He wore Persian clothing at times, adopted local customs, not to blend in, but to govern. This unsettled his men. Were they conquerors, or something else entirely? Alexander did not explain. He rarely did. He believed understanding would come later. Between battles, the army slowed. Rest became necessary. So did reflection. The distance from Macedonia grew longer with every step. Home became memory, and memory became myth. Alexander knew this feeling well. Once you go far enough, there is no return, only continuation. Darius finally moved. His army gathered in vast numbers, more men than Alexander could ever command. The ground trembled beneath marching feet. This would not be a test. It would be a statement. One king would stand, the other would fall. There would be no ambiguity. Scouts brought word of the approaching Persian force. Alexander listened in silence, then nodded. He had expected this. In fact, he had been waiting. This was not a war of raids anymore. It was now a war of kings, and kings, he believed, should meet face to face. The two armies drew closer, over days, not hours. Tension stretched thin. Men sharpened blades that did not need sharpening. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams mixed with fear. Alexander walked among his soldiers once more, not to inspire, but to observe. Leadership, he knew, begins with seeing. As night fell, fires dotted the landscape like distant stars. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Darius waited. Two rulers, two visions of power, one world not large enough for both. Tomorrow would decide which vision endured. For now, the earth rested. Quietly, before history moved again, Darius chose the battlefield carefully. A wide, open plain, flat, cleared of obstacles, perfect for numbers, perfect for cavalry, perfect, he believed, for overwhelming force. The land itself was shaped for advantage, but advantage, when over-prepared, can become a trap without its owner realizing. Persian engineers worked through the night, stones removed, ground leveled, chariots fitted with blades, everything designed to crush resistance through scale. Darius trusted size, trusted symmetry, trusted preparation. What he underestimated was flexibility, the one thing Alexander valued above all else. Alexander studied the plain at dusk. He said little. He asked few questions. Instead, he walked, measured distances, imagined movement, where chaos might begin, where control could be lost. His generals waited for commands. They did not come yet. Alexander was still listening, not to men, but to the land. That evening, his officers gathered. Some urged caution. Others demanded attack at once. Alexander waited until voices faded, then spoke softly. "We fight at dawn. No speeches, no dramatics. Just certainty. Confidence delivered calmly often carries more weight than any display of force." Across the field, Darius did not sleep. He remained awake, expecting a night assault. Torches burned. Guards stayed alert. Hours passed slowly. Nothing happened. By morning, Persian troops were exhausted. Alexander had attacked without lifting a sword. Fatigue, he knew, was a weapon. As dawn broke, the two armies faced each other. Silence stretched between them, a space filled with fear, anticipation, and history waiting to be written. Alexander mounted his horse. He wore simple armor, no symbols, no excess. He wanted his men to see him as one of them, present, calm, ready. The Persians advanced first. Scythed chariots surged forward, blades flashing. Alexander gave a single signal. The formation shifted smoothly, not backward, not forward, aside. The chariots passed through empty space, neutralized without chaos. Preparation met adaptation, and adaptation won instantly. Alexander struck where Darius watched, not randomly, directly. A focused thrust toward the center, toward the king. Panic spreads fastest when leadership trembles. Darius saw the line bend, then break, and in that moment the empire hesitated. Just long enough. Darius turned his chariot. Retreat began at the top, and when kings retreat, armies unravel. Persian lines collapsed inward. Confusion replaced command. Alexander pursued briefly, then stopped. Victory was already decided. Chasing endlessly only creates new risks. Control, not destruction, was the goal. By midday, the greatest empire on earth was broken. Not destroyed, broken. Darius fled east. Alexander stood on the plain of Gaugamela, knowing something irreversible had occurred. He had not just defeated a king, he had ended an era, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any battle noise before it. The road to Babylon lay open, no walls closed, no resistance formed. The city prepared not for battle, but for arrival. Priests gathered, gates were washed, flowers lined the streets. Alexander entered slowly, not as a raider, but as a ruler stepping into legacy. Babylon did not fall. It welcomed. The people watched carefully. They expected cruelty. They saw restraint. Alexander forbade looting. Temples were protected. Local leaders remained in place. This confused many. Conquerors usually took. Alexander observed. Power, he understood, lasts longer when it feels familiar to those who must live beneath it. Within the palace, Alexander encountered abundance. Gold beyond counting, silk, perfume, quiet luxury that spoke of centuries of rule. He walked through the halls slowly, not impressed, not dismissive, just aware. This was what victory offered, and it was tempting to stay. His men began to change. Some grew comfortable. Others grew uneasy. They had followed him across continents, expecting an ending, but there was none. The journey continued. Home felt distant now, not just geographically, but emotionally. Alexander noticed this shift. He did not address it. Not yet. Alexander adopted Persian customs more openly. Ceremonies, dress, court rituals. To him, this was governance. To his Macedonian officers, it felt like betrayal. Whispers grew. Questions formed. Was he still their king, or something else entirely? Alexander heard the whispers. He let them breathe. That night, Alexander dreamed of distance, of oceans not yet crossed, of lands unnamed, Victory had not satisfied him. It had sharpened hunger. Some men seek conquest to prove themselves. Others, because they cannot stop moving. Once they begin, Alexander belonged to the second kind. Administrators arrived. Records were kept. Taxes reorganized. An empire does not survive on battles alone. Alexander knew this. He ruled patiently, methodically. Yet beneath the structure, something unstable formed. The more power he gathered, the more isolated he became. Command grows lonelier. With every success, Darius remained alive, fleeing east, still a symbol. Alexander could not ignore that. An empire without its king is wounded, but a living king is a rallying point. The pursuit resumed, not in haste, in certainty. This story, Alexander believed, required a final chapter. As the army moved again, the mood was different. Less excitement, more obligation. They were no longer invading Persia. They were inside it, every step deeper, made retreat less imaginable. Alexander sensed the tension. Leadership now meant holding together men who no longer shared the same dream. When night fell, Babylon glowed behind them. Ahead lay mountains, deserts, and resistance yet unseen. Alexander did not look back. He rarely did. He believed destiny, waited only forward. And those who hesitated were already falling behind. The march continued, quietly, relentlessly. Darius fled eastward, but power drained with every mile. Satraps hesitated. Allies vanished. What followed him now was not an army, but doubt. The great king of Persia rode not as a ruler, but as a symbol, slowly losing its meaning. An empire can survive defeat. It cannot survive disbelief. Alexander advanced steadily, not urgently. He knew time favored him. Every delay weakened Darius further. Loyalty shifts quietly, often before anyone notices. Some Persian nobles already sent messages, not pledges, questions. Alexander read them carefully. He replied to none. Silence, he understood, invites decision. Darius was seized by his own men, not in rage, in calculation. They believed, delivering him might buy mercy. They bound their king and turned east again, hoping distance would save them. But betrayal, once chosen, rarely leads to safety. It only shortens the road to consequences. Alexander arrived too late. Darius lay dying, wounded by those who once swore loyalty. The king's eyes opened briefly. No speech followed, no final command, just recognition. Alexander ordered respect. Darius was covered, honored, sent for burial as a king. This gesture was deliberate. Conquest without dignity creates endless enemies. With Darius dead, Persia was leaderless. But Alexander did not celebrate. Something essential had shifted. There was no rival left, no equal force to measure himself against. Victory without resistance can feel emptier than struggle. Alexander had defeated the world, and now stood alone within it. He declared himself successor to the Persian kings. Not destroyer, not outsider, successor. This decision mattered. It reshaped the war's meaning. Some followed willingly. Others obeyed reluctantly. Alexander did not argue. Authority, once claimed confidently, often sustains itself through acceptance. The army moved deeper east, into lands unfamiliar. Languages shifted. Customs changed. The known world dissolved behind them. Alexander pressed forward anyway. He believed limits were invented by those who needed them. But limits, when ignored too long, begin to respond in other ways. Tension grew among his officers. They questioned the endless march. the adoption of foreign customs, the absence of return. Alexander listened, then dismissed the concerns. He saw hesitation as weakness, but leadership requires balance between vision and the weight carried by those who follow. That night, Alexander could not sleep. He stood beneath unfamiliar stars, realizing something quietly profound. There was no homeland ahead, no familiar destination, only expansion, only continuation. The boy who had crossed into Asia to avenge Greece was gone. In his place stood something new and increasingly isolated. With Persia conquered, Alexander chose not to stop. Stopping would mean asking questions he was not ready to answer. So the march continued eastward, toward mountains, toward deserts, toward the edge of endurance. History watched silently, as a man who had conquered everything refused to conquer himself. The farther east they marched, the more resistance changed shape. No grand armies, no open fields, only sudden attacks, vanishing enemies, and terrain that refused control. This was not conquest by spectacle. It was erosion, slow, relentless. Alexander adapted quickly, but adaptation, over time, demands something in return. Local uprisings flared without warning. Villages resisted quietly. Supply lines stretched thin. Patience wore down. Alexander responded decisively. Too decisively, some thought. Punishment replaced negotiation. Speed replaced mercy. What once felt calculated, now felt personal. Power, when challenged endlessly, begins to harden. Among his officers, concern turned into fear. They no longer recognized the tone of his decisions. The Alexander who once listened now commanded. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Victory had reshaped him, and those closest felt the shift first. Leadership was no longer shared. It was enforced. Clitus was among them, a man who had saved Alexander's life, a voice unafraid to speak plainly. At a feast, wine loosened restraint. Words turned sharp. Old grievances surfaced. Clitus spoke of Macedonia, of tradition, of limits. Alexander heard defiance, not loyalty, and in a moment, control was lost. The room fell silent. Clitus lay dead, struck by the hand of the king he once protected. Alexander froze. The cost of command stood before him, undeniable. No enemy had done this. No battle demanded it. This was the result of unchecked authority, colliding with memory. Regret followed swiftly. Alexander withdrew. He refused food, refused company. The army waited. Silence stretched painfully. The invincible king had confronted something he could not conquer. Himself. For days, he remained isolated, questioning whether destiny was guiding him or consuming him. Eventually, he returned to command, but something was gone. Trust, once broken, rarely reforms the same way. The men followed him still, but differently. Less warmth, more distance. Alexander sensed it and chose not to acknowledge it. Some leaders move forward because looking back hurts too much. The march resumed. Mountains rose ahead. Cold replaced heat. Familiar comforts vanished. Each step demanded endurance. Alexander pushed harder. Rest became scarce. Doubt became quiet. This was no longer expansion. It was obsession. And obsession, once awakened, rarely sleeps. Letters from home arrived rarely. When they did, they felt distant. Macedonia belonged to another life now. Alexander had outgrown it, or perhaps abandoned it. He was no longer a king of a place, but of movement itself. Forward was the only direction. That still made sense. As night fell, snow drifted across the camp. Alexander stood alone, watching his breath fade into darkness. He had conquered empires, broken kings, redefined the world, yet peace eluded him. Greatness, he was learning, demands a price. Few understand, until it is too late. Beyond the mountains, the world changed again. The air grew heavier, the land greener, then wetter. Rain fell without pause. Days blurred together. The men marched through mud, through rivers that swallowed roads, through forests that refused order. This was not Persia. This was something older, wilder, and far less willing to bend. Stories reached the camp. Of war, elephants. Of armies that fought differently. Of lands that swallowed conquerors whole. The men listened in silence. They had followed Alexander everywhere. But this felt different. Not fear exactly. Something closer to exhaustion. A sense that the edge of the world was no longer behind them, but directly ahead. Alexander pushed forward. He always did. Rain did not slow him. Loss did not deter him. Each new challenge felt like proof that he was still alive, but the army felt otherwise. Their bodies ached, their weapons rusted, and home, once distant, now felt impossibly far away. The battles here were brutal, close, confusing. Elephants charged without fear. The ground shook beneath them. Victory came, but at a cost that lingered. Wounds healed slowly. Morale even slower. For the first time, conquest no longer inspired pride, only survival. At night, the camp was quiet, too quiet. Men stared into fires. Without speaking, they counted years, counted losses, counted how much of themselves they had left behind. Alexander noticed the silence, and for the first time, he did not know how to break it. Whispers began, not of rebellion, of return, of rest, of endings. These were dangerous ideas. Alexander sensed them immediately. He called his generals together, spoke of destiny, of the unknown still ahead. But words, no matter how powerful, cannot refill empty bodies. The soldiers listened respectfully. Then one spoke, then another. They had marched far enough, fought long enough, conquered more than any army before them. They did not refuse Alexander. They begged him to stop, to turn back, to let them live. Alexander was silent. The request struck deeper than any blade. This was not defiance. It was truth. He walked alone afterward, listening to rain soak the earth. For the first time in years, the path forward felt heavier than the path behind. By morning, the decision was made, not celebrated, not announced with pride. The march east would end here. They would return. Alexander stood before the army, his voice steady. Some cheered. Others wept. Even victory, it seemed, could feel like loss. As the army turned back, Alexander looked once more, toward the horizon, not with regret, but with recognition. He had reached the limit of command, where leadership yields to human endurance. The world had been conquered. Now, it was time to survive it. The return began without celebration. No songs, no triumph, only movement. The army turned westward, carrying victory like a burden. What lay ahead was not battle, but distance. Endless distance. Alexander chose the southern route, through the Gedrosian desert, a decision that would haunt every step that followed. The land stripped them slowly. Water vanished first, then shade, then certainty. The sun burned without mercy. The ground reflected heat upward, trapping them between fire and fire. Men collapsed quietly, not screaming, not resisting, simply stopping. Alexander marched on foot, sharing the same dust, the same thirst. Supplies failed. Animals died. Men carried what they could, then left it behind. Discipline dissolved into survival. Ranks thinned. Days blurred together. There was no enemy to fight. No victory to win. Only endurance. And endurance, once exhausted, offers no second chances. At one point, a soldier brought Alexander water. A single helmet full. Alexander looked at it, then poured it onto the sand. If his men could not drink, neither would he. The gesture spread quickly. Not hope, but respect. In suffering, symbols still mattered. Many did not survive the crossing. They were buried without ceremony. Sometimes not buried at all. The desert erased names. Erased numbers. Erased memory. Alexander counted the losses privately. Each one carved deeper than any battlefield wound. Conquest had taken its toll. Now nature collected its share. When the survivors finally reached safety, they were changed. Thinner, quieter, older. Alexander had lost more men. To the desert than to any army. This truth followed him like a shadow. Victory no longer felt vast, only fragile. They returned to cities once conquered. But nothing felt the same. The army was smaller, the silence heavier. Alexander ruled still, but with less certainty. His body, too, showed strain. Wounds healed slowly. Fever lingered. Rest, when it came, felt temporary. In Babylon, plans resumed. New campaigns imagined. New worlds discussed. But something had shifted. The men listened politely. Without fire, Alexander noticed he was still king, still commander. But the bond forged in youth had thinned under years of command. At night, Alexander reflected often, not on failures, but on time. He had lived intensely, quickly, perhaps too quickly. There were no pauses in his life, only movement. And now, even rest felt like interruption. As summer approached, the air in Babylon grew thick, heavy. Still, Alexander felt unwell. At first, it seemed minor. Fatigue, heat, nothing more. He dismissed concern. There was always more to do. Destiny, he believed, did not wait. The fever came quietly. No sudden collapse. No dramatic moment. Just heat beneath the skin. Fatigue that refused to fade. Alexander continued working, meeting envoys, planning campaigns, issuing orders. But those close to him noticed. His movements slowed, his focus drifted. The man who never stopped was beginning to pause. Doctors were summoned. They spoke softly, carefully. No one wanted to name fear. Treatments were applied. Herbs, cold water, rest. Alexander resisted rest at first. A king, he believed, could not afford weakness. But weakness does not ask permission. It arrives when it chooses. Within days, Alexander could no longer rise. The room darkened. Shutters closed against the heat. Guards stood silent outside. Whispers traveled the corridors, not rumors, questions. What happens when the center no longer holds? An empire, like a body, depends on its heart. Messages arrived from generals. They waited. They watched. They worried. Alexander listened from his bed, sometimes alert, sometimes distant. He spoke less now, not because he lacked words, but because he was conserving them. Each sentence felt expensive, each breath measured. Time slowed around him. The army sensed it. Silence spread through the camp. No drills. No celebration. Men stood in small groups, speaking quietly. They remembered earlier years, the young king, the first battles, the feeling of invincibility. That feeling was gone. In its place stood uncertainty, heavy and unmoving. Alexander asked for his commanders. One by one, they entered the room. He greeted them calmly. There was no panic in his voice, Only focus. He issued instructions, clarified arrangements, listened more than he spoke. This was not a man surrendering. This was a man preparing for absence. The question everyone feared was finally asked. To whom would the empire belong? Alexander paused. His eyes moved slowly across the room. He answered softly, to the strongest. The words settled heavily. They did not resolve uncertainty. They created it. Strength, once contested, invites conflict. As days passed, Alexander grew weaker. Speech became difficult. Gestures replaced commands. His mind drifted between moments. Childhood in Macedonia, dusty battlefields, endless roads eastward. The world he had shaped now waited silently for him to release it. The generals returned often. They leaned close, hoping for clarity, for correction, for one last order. Alexander looked at them, recognizing ambition, fear, loyalty, and hunger. He said nothing more. Some truths, once spoken, cannot be refined. On the final day, Alexander could no longer speak. He raised his hand slowly, acknowledging the men who had followed him to the edge of the world. Then he rested it again. The room fell still. No command followed, no vision, just silence, the kind that marks the end of motion. Alexander died as the sun fell. No cry announced it. No trumpet sounded, just a stillness that spread through the room. The man who had never stopped moving was suddenly completely still. Outside, the city of Babylon continued, unaware that the world had just changed shape. Word traveled slowly at first, then all at once. Guards stiffened, servants froze, generals stood apart, each calculating silence differently. There was no plan, no sealed decree, only a body and an empire that no longer had a voice to command it. The army gathered quietly. Men who had crossed deserts and broken kingdoms stood motionless. Some wept openly. Others stared ahead, unable to reconcile the still figure with the unstoppable force they had followed for years. Greatness, they were learning, can vanish without warning. Alexander's body did not decay. Days passed, then weeks. The air remained unchanged. To some, this felt like a sign. To others, an inconvenience delaying decisions. Even in death, Alexander inspired myth and hesitation. The longer he lay unburied, the harder it became to accept finality. Discussions began in quiet rooms, not arguments yet, just positioning, just questions. Who commands the army? Who rules the cities? Who speaks for Alexander now? Each general remembered the words he had spoken to the strongest, and each believed, in some way, that it could be him. They prepared the funeral with care. Gold, purple cloth, incense. A king deserved spectacle, but beneath the ritual, fractures widened, alliances shifted subtly, loyalty recalculated. The empire, built by one will, was beginning to pull itself apart. Alexander's son had not yet been born. His brother was unfit to rule. Regency was declared temporary, they claimed. Temporary arrangements, however, have a habit of becoming permanent. When power is involved, the future of the empire rested on promises, already thinning. The army remained intact, for now. Orders were still obeyed, marches still organized, but the unifying force was gone. Without Alexander, discipline relied on memory, and memory, over time, fades, especially when ambition offers a louder voice. As the body was finally prepared to leave Babylon, men lined the streets, not cheering, not mourning loudly, just watching. They understood instinctively. This was not just a funeral. It was the closing of an era that would never return. Alexander had conquered the world, but he had not secured its future. That task he left behind. As the procession moved away, the empire remained vast, fragile, and already changing. The silence that followed him was heavier than any battlefield roar. After the funeral, movement resumed, but without unity. Generals issued orders that overlapped, contradicted, or quietly ignored one another. What had once been a single will was now many, and many wills, without agreement, pull in different directions, even when they claim the same purpose. Soon, the empire fractured, not all at once, slowly, territory by territory. Former allies became rivals. Promises dissolved. Campaigns turned inward. The wars that followed were not about expansion, but possession. Alexander's world was being divided by those who had built it. The Diadochi, his successors, fought for decades. Battles echoed across lands, once united under one banner. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Borders shifted endlessly. Each claimed legitimacy. None carried authority. The empire survived in fragments. But its soul, the force that held it together, was gone. And yet, Alexander did not disappear. His name endured. Greek language spread eastward. Ideas followed armies long gone. Cities he founded continued to breathe. Trade routes expanded. Cultures mixed. What he built physically collapsed. What he set in motion continued quietly. Long after his death, Alexander had not ruled long, barely over a decade. Yet his shadow stretched centuries. Kings compared themselves to him. Generals studied him. Stories reshaped him. He became more than a man, a measure, a symbol of what ambition could achieve and what it could consume. In the process, some remembered him as a hero, others as a tyrant, many as both. He inspired loyalty, fear, and awe in equal measure. He crossed boundaries, geographical, cultural, human, but he never learned how to stop crossing them. Perhaps that, more than conquest, defined him. Alexander died young, before time could soften him, before failure could reshape him. History froze him at his peak, forever advancing, forever undefeated. We remember him, not as he might have become, but as he was, brilliant, restless, and incomplete. His empire fell apart. That truth is undeniable. But the world it left behind was no longer the same. East and West had touched. Ideas had traveled. Borders had blurred. The ancient world was now connected in ways it had never been before. Alexander sought eternity through action, through motion, through conquest. What he found instead was influence less dramatic, but longer lasting. Empires fade, stories remain. And some stories, once told, refuse to sleep. As night settles, Alexander's journey finally rests. Not in a tomb, but in memory. A reminder that greatness moves quickly, burns intensely, and leaves echoes long after it is gone. Now, let the world grow quiet. The march has ended, and history, for a moment, can sleep